I came home from war to find my 7-year-old son locked in a freezing basement by the man I trusted most. And when I called the police, the officer took one look at my father and backed down. The scratching sound stopped me cold. I'd been home for less than 5 minutes, boots still on, duffel bag still on my shoulder. The smell of the house hit me first, stale beer and something else underneath it. Something sour and wrong that hadn't been there when I left. I'd survived 2 IED attacks in Kandahar province. I'd held a dying man's hand in the dirt while a medevac was still 12 minutes out. I'd buried 3 brothers in arms in foreign soil and come home carrying their names like rocks in my chest. None of that, not 1 second of it, had prepared me for what I heard next. Faint, rhythmic, desperate, a scratching sound coming from behind a door I didn't recognize. A door with a padlock on it. A door that led to the basement of the house I'd grown up in. The house I'd trusted my son to. The house I'd been sending $400 a month to for household expenses while I was deployed. I stood there for 3 full seconds, just listening. Then my father's voice came from the living room. "That's just Marcus learning some respect. Marcus, my 7-year-old son. Give me the key." My voice came out wrong, too quiet, too controlled. The kind of quiet that happens when something in you knows that if you let it get loud, you'll lose the thread entirely. "Calm down," my father said. He didn't move from his recliner, beer in hand. 2 in the afternoon. He looked at me with this lazy half smile, like I was overreacting about something minor, like I'd come home and caught him letting the kids stay up past bedtime. "Boy needed discipline while you were out playing soldier." I didn't wait. I took the key from the kitchen hook, the same hook it had always been on, same hook my mother hung her keys on for 30 years, and I ran. When I opened that basement door, the smell hit me first. Cold concrete, damp air, something sour and biological underneath it all. The light was off. I called his name. For a second, nothing. Then a small shape at the bottom of the stairs shifted. Marcus, huddled against the wall, filthy, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in on a video call 3 weeks ago. He looked up at me, and for 1 second, just 1 terrible second, he didn't recognize me. He'd been down there long enough to stop believing rescue was real. I carried him up. He weighed nothing. When I pulled his sleeves back to check him over, he flinched and tried to pull them down again. Automatic, practiced, like he'd learned that letting someone see meant getting hurt worse. The bruises were everywhere. Finger mark bruising on both arms, linear welts across his back, raised and yellowish at their centers. Not fresh, but not old either. Bruising across his shins in patterns that told a story I didn't want to understand. There was a bucket in the corner of the basement, for the bathroom. My father stood in the doorway of the living room and told me I was overreacting. "Boys need toughening up," he said. "Your soft parenting is exactly why he needed a firm hand while you were gone." He said this while my son was shaking in my arms. While I was standing there understanding, fully, completely all at once, that the man I'd trusted most in this world had been hurting my child for 10 months. I called the police. Officer Kenny Briggs arrived 15 minutes later. Young, new to the force, I could tell. He listened carefully, took notes, asked the right questions. I showed him the basement, the padlock, the bucket, Marcus's arms. He was writing everything down with the energy of someone doing the job right. Then he asked to speak with my father. Walter Greer stood up slowly. He was 63 years old, 6 feet 2, 230 pounds of military posture. Command Sergeant Major, retired. 3 wars. A VFW photo on the wall signed by a state senator. A community service award from the mayor on the mantle. 40 years of this town knowing his name and trusting his word. He straightened his VFW cap, let the decorations on his chest catch the light, and he looked at Officer Briggs with the full weight of every rank he'd ever held. Something shifted in that room. Briggs stepped back, physically stepped back. His voice changed, dropped, softened, the way voices do when someone suddenly remembers who they're talking to. And then he looked at me and said, "Sir, is that really your father?" My stomach dropped through the floor. "Yes," I said. "And why does that matter when my son was just locked in a basement?" Briggs looked between us, uncomfortable, calculating. My father spoke then, calm, measured, authoritative, the way he always did when he needed to control a room. Marcus had been misbehaving. The basement timeout was old-school discipline, nothing more. He mentioned his service record, his reputation, his 40 years in this town and what they meant. He was reasonable and self-assured and devastating. Briggs listened, nodded slowly, wrote something down. Then he said it looked like a family matter, suggested we work it out internally, and left. I stood in that living room holding my shaking son, watching the patrol car back out of the driveway and disappear down the road, and understood something I hadn't fully understood before, that my father's medals, his name, his reputation in this town were armor, functional, tested armor, and the whole system around him had been helping him wear it for decades. He sat back down in his recliner, cracked open another beer, and told me I'd made a mistake calling the police, that I'd embarrassed him, that if I didn't like how he'd run things in his house, I was welcome to leave. I didn't leave. I carried Marcus upstairs and drew him a bath, and while he soaked, I stood outside the door taking photographs of every bruise on his body with shaking hands, documenting each one with a timestamp on my phone. Then I sat down on the bathroom floor and started making calls. My name is Corporal Daniel Greer. I was 29 years old when I came home from my second deployment to Afghanistan to find my son in that basement. What happened in the months that followed changed changed my understanding of power, protection, reputation, and what it actually means to fight for someone you love. This is the full story. I enlisted at 21, right out of junior college. Not because I had nowhere else to go, I had options, but I believed in service. My father had instilled that. Command Sergeant Major Walter Greer had 3 wars worth of stories about duty and honor and protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. Growing up in his house in Millhaven, Georgia, those weren't abstract values. They were dinner table conversation. They were the reason I made my bed tight enough to bounce a quarter off it from the time I was 6 years old. My mother, Patricia, died when I was 17. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to burial. She was the warmth in that house. After she was gone, the house ran on discipline and silence. My father wasn't cruel to me growing up. Not exactly. He was hard, critical, exacting. The kind of father who never hit you but could make you feel worthless with 3 words. I'd confuse that with toughening for a long time. A lot of people who grew up that way do. I met Kara when I was 23 and she was 22. She was funny and direct and had this quality I can only describe as clarity. She saw through performance instantly, including mine. We got married fast, probably too fast, and Marcus came along 14 months after the wedding. He was the best surprise of my life. I was holding him in the delivery room thinking about how I was going to do everything differently from how I'd been raised. Softer, warmer, more present. Kara and I held together for about 3 years after Marcus was born. The marriage didn't survive my first deployment. That's the honest version. We split in the spring when Marcus was 4, and it was painful, but not ugly. We both agreed Marcus came first, and we meant it. She got primary custody, which made sense since I was still active duty. I got visits when I was stateside and video calls when I wasn't. Then, 6 months before my second deployment, Kara was in a car accident on Route 9 outside of Millhaven. She survived, but she had a traumatic brain injury that required months of inpatient rehabilitation. She couldn't care for Marcus. Her parents were in Oregon, elderly, not able to take on a 4-year-old full-time. My sister Rachel lived in Atlanta and worked 60-hour weeks. The options were thin. My father volunteered, called me directly, said, "Son, blood is blood. Bring Marcus to me. I'll take care of him." And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. I'd seen him be hard. I'd never seen him be cruel. There's a difference, I'd told myself. He'd been a good enough grandfather when Kara and I were together. Stern, a little formal, not exactly warm, but present. He came to Marcus's birthday parties. He sent Christmas gifts. He called occasionally and asked about school. I told myself the man who raised me with those values about duty and honor would not hurt a child. I was wrong. And I had been wrong about which qualities ran deepest in him. The first red flag I missed came 5 weeks after Marcus moved in. I called on a Sunday and Marcus was quiet, quieter than usual. I asked him if he was okay and he said yes. I asked if Grandpa was being nice and he paused. Just a half second, but I heard it and said, "He's teaching me things." I thought that was good. I asked what kind of things and Marcus said, "About being quiet." I laughed. I actually laughed. I thought my father was teaching him manners, table discipline, the military-adjacent structure that had defined my own childhood. I told myself Marcus needed some structure with Kara recovering. I told myself a little strictness wouldn't hurt. The second red flag came 2 months later. I was on a video call and Marcus had a bruise on his cheek. I asked immediately, what happened? My father, who was in the frame just off camera, answered for him. Marcus had fallen off his bike. They'd just gotten him a bike. Marcus loved it. Marcus nodded and said yes, the bike. I asked Marcus directly. He said the bike. I let it go. I let it go, and I am still living with that. The monthly $400 I was sending for household expenses, food, utilities, Marcus's needs, was something my father had asked for casually in the 3rd week. "Boy eats a lot," he'd said with a chuckle. "Help me out a little." I said of course. I would have sent more if he'd asked. I was grateful he'd stepped up. I didn't know until much later that my father had stopped buying Marcus school lunches by month 3, telling the school his grandson brought lunch from home. He wasn't bringing lunch from home. He was going hungry 3 days a week at school, and the school, where Walter Greer's reputation was a known quantity, had not called me. By month 5, the school had noted that Marcus was frequently tired, withdrawn, and had lost weight. They sent a note home. My father signed the response form, indicating everything was fine, that Marcus had been ill but was recovering. No one called me. By month 8, Marcus had stopped talking much at all. He answered questions in 1 or 2 words. He didn't play at recess. His teacher, a young woman named Mrs. Alford in her first year of teaching, had flagged it to the school counselor. The counselor had called the house. My father had spoken with her for 40 minutes and apparently reassured her that Marcus was going through an adjustment with his parents' separation and his mother's medical situation. He'd framed himself as the stable, caring presence and framed the concern as an overreaction. The counselor had backed down. I was in Kandahar by then, and the last video call I had with Marcus, 3 weeks before my transport home, was the one where he'd worn long sleeves in 90-degree Georgia heat and told me he was fine, Grandpa was nice, school was okay. He was 7 years old and he'd already learned to perform normalcy for the camera because the alternative was worse. I had missed all of it. That knowledge, that specific, precise weight, is something I carry every day. When I came home and found him in that basement, I understood the full picture in a way I hadn't in the weeks before when I'd sensed something was off but couldn't name it. The picture wasn't a failure of information. It was a failure of imagination. I hadn't been able to imagine my father doing this, so the information hadn't landed the way it should have. I made those calls from the bathroom floor. First, the base hospital, who connected me to a child trauma nurse who told me exactly which documentation to collect. Second, my commanding officer, Captain Lena Torres, who listened without interrupting and said, "Greer, do what you need to do. You have my full support, officially on the record." Third, my attorney, Diane Holloway, who had 26 years in family law and who, when I described what Officer Briggs had done, went silent for a long moment before saying, "We need to move fast. His reputation can insulate him, but only if we let it." The medical appointment was at 8 the next morning. I drove Marcus to the base hospital, which was 32 miles from Millhaven, specifically so we'd be outside local jurisdiction and away from anyone who knew my father's name. Dr. Carol Emmons was board certified in pediatrics with a subspecialty in child trauma. She examined Marcus with the careful patience of someone who'd done this before and understood that hurrying a frightened child gets you nowhere. It took most of the morning. 11 pounds underweight for his age and height. A urinary tract infection, almost certainly caused by restricted bathroom access. Bruising across his back and upper legs in a pattern Dr. Emmons described in her notes as consistent with repeated belt strikes of varying age. She noted 3 healed rib fractures on his left side, old enough to be partially calcified, meaning they'd happened months earlier and had never been treated. 3 healed rib fractures. My 7-year-old son had broken ribs that had healed crooked in his chest because no one had taken him to a doctor. When Dr. Emmons asked Marcus how he'd gotten hurt, in a voice so soft and careful it broke something in me, he told her, starting small, then more. The basement wasn't a new punishment. It was a regular one. It had started as an hour, then longer. He'd been left down there overnight at least 4 times that he could remember. The belt had started around month 3. He'd learned that crying made it worse, so he'd stopped crying. He was 7 years old. He'd stopped crying because he'd learned crying was punished. Dr. Emmons filed her mandatory CPS report that afternoon. The document ran to 11 pages. The CPS caseworker, a man named Gerald Fouts, arrived the next morning and interviewed my father at the house while I waited outside with Marcus in the car. I watched through the window. My father sat in his recliner, composed, polite, completely controlled. He was wearing his VFW hat. He had his service commendation on the side table where it was clearly visible. When Fouts came out, he told me Walter had said the belt was necessary discipline, that the basement was a timeout method, and that he had said both things without a trace of shame or remorse. Fouts filed an emergency protection order placing Marcus in my sole care, effective immediately. But he warned me, "Your father has significant standing in this community. The DA's office is going to be under pressure. Prepare yourself." Over the next 3 days, I watched the pressure materialize in real time. The assigned criminal detective, a 19-year veteran named Ray Castellano who coached youth football with my father 30 years ago, called me in for a meeting and spent 40 minutes suggesting that misguided discipline and criminal child abuse were legally distinct categories and that the DA's office would need to weigh the evidence carefully. He mentioned my father's service. He mentioned the town's relationship with his family. He said twice that charging a decorated veteran for what might be characterized as old-school parenting was a significant step. I sat there and listened to all of it. Then I told him there were 3 healed rib fractures in my son's chest that had never been treated, and I asked him how that fit into the old-school parenting category. He wrote something down, said he'd forward everything to the DA. He did not look like a man who was going to push hard. I went home and called Diane. I told her about Castellano. She was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said something that changed everything. "Daniel, there are other people who saw this. This didn't happen in isolation. Your father has a pattern and patterns leave witnesses. I think I know where to start." She started with the school. Mrs. Alford, Marcus's first-year teacher, had documented every concern she'd had in a personal notebook she kept outside the official school system because she'd felt instinctively that anything going through the official channels would get back to Walter before it got anywhere useful. She had dates, behavioral notes, observations about weight loss, descriptions of bruising she'd seen on Marcus's arms during art class in October, November, and December. She had a note she'd written to herself after the school counselor had backed down. "I don't think this is right. I don't know what to do." She gave Diane everything. Then Diane found Sandra Briggs, no relation to the officer, who lived 2 houses down from my father and who had called CPS 8 months earlier with a concern about sounds coming from the basement late at night. She'd heard a child crying. She'd called. A caseworker had come out, had spoken with my father, and had closed the case without interviewing Marcus alone. The caseworker who'd closed that earlier case, it turned out, had coached youth football alongside Ray Castellano, alongside my father. It was a web, not a conspiracy, just decades of relationships and deference, and a community that had decided Walter Greer's reputation meant more than questions about what happened inside his house. Diane had 2 family law colleagues review everything and agreed. There was enough to request a federal review of the local law enforcement response, specifically on the grounds that the initial officer's deference and the subsequent detective's reluctance to charge constituted a pattern of failure earlier to protect a child. She filed that request on a Thursday. On Friday, my father called me for the first time since I'd taken Marcus. He was calm. His voice was the voice I'd grown up with, steady, authoritative, faintly disappointed, the way it got when he felt I'd embarrassed him. He said what happened with Marcus had been handled reasonably, that I was making something out of nothing, that I was about to destroy a good man's name over a misunderstanding between generations who saw discipline differently. I let him finish. Then I said, "Dad, Marcus had broken ribs, 3 of them. They healed wrong because you never took him to a doctor. He stopped crying because he learned crying made things worse. He was in a basement with a bucket for a bathroom. That's not a generational difference, that's abuse, and I am going to make sure it is called exactly what it is." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are making the worst mistake of your life." I said, "I don't think so." I hung up. Diane had told me what was coming, and she was right. Within the week, my father had made calls. The VFW chapter leadership, 5 men who'd known Walter for 30 years, sent a letter to the DA's office expressing concern that the charges were politically motivated and urging restraint. A local pastor who'd known my family for 20 years called me personally to tell me that my father was struggling, that he was an old man, that maybe reconciliation was possible if I was willing to hear his side. I told the pastor respectfully that I was not interested in reconciliation until Marcus was safe and his abuser was held accountable. My Aunt Loretta, my father's younger sister who lived in Savannah, called me and told me I was destroying the family, that my mother would be ashamed of me, that a son didn't do this to his father. That one hit differently. I won't pretend it didn't. But then, the same week, Rachel called. My sister Rachel, who lived in Atlanta, who'd only been able to take Marcus for occasional weekends over the past year, told me she'd noticed things she hadn't said out loud because she hadn't known what to do with them. Marcus being frightened when my father's name was mentioned. Marcus flinching at raised voices during a birthday party at her house. Marcus asking her once if she thought Grandpa was nice. She'd told herself it was the adjustment. She'd told herself Walter was just strict. "I should have said something," she said. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry." I told her she was saying something now, that it counted. She'd become one of our most important witnesses. She had her own observations, her own timeline, her own account of a child who'd shown signs that, in retrospect, couldn't be read any other way. The Federal Review pushed the DA's hand. 3 weeks after Diane filed, DA Patricia Ames announced that she was opening an independent criminal investigation into the abuse of Marcus Greer and the prior handling of the complaint by local law enforcement. The charges against Walter Greer were filed 4 weeks after that: aggravated child abuse, criminal neglect, and willful endangerment of a minor. The investigation into the prior CPS case closure was referred to the State Oversight Board. Detective Castellano was placed on administrative review. Officer Briggs was required to attend remedial training on mandatory reporting standards and bias in protective service response. My father's attorney filed immediately to suppress the medical records on procedural grounds. The motion was denied. He then filed a motion suggesting my own fitness as a parent should be evaluated, given that I'd voluntarily placed the child in a high-risk environment. The motion was denied in 2 sentences. Walter did not make bail easily. It took 11 days and a property bond on the house I'd grown up in. He was released to a VFW acquaintance's home, with a no-contact order covering both Marcus and me. During those 11 days, Marcus slept through the night for the first time in months. He'd been placed with a trauma-specialized child therapist named Dr. Yvonne Reyes, who saw him 3 times a week and who was, over time, gentle and patient enough to reach him. He didn't talk much at first. He drew pictures instead. He drew the same picture for 3 weeks running, a small figure at the bottom of a dark space and a rectangle of light above it. Then, one session, he drew a figure coming down the stairs toward the small figure. Dr. Reyes asked him who that was. Marcus said, "That's my dad. I wasn't in the room for that." She told me about it afterward. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after that. The trial took 14 months to arrive, which is not unusual in cases of this complexity. In that time, Marcus and I built something. We found a 2-bedroom apartment in a town 30 miles from Millhaven, far enough that we weren't running into my father's people at the grocery store, close enough that Kara, who was continuing her recovery and making real progress, could visit regularly. Kara and I had our own conversations about what had happened, hard ones, about the choices we'd both made when we were trying to figure out impossible logistics with a deployment and an injury and a little boy caught between. We didn't resolve everything, but we committed to Marcus together, fully, without reservation. He started 2nd grade in our new town. He was behind in reading. He had night terrors until the spring. He didn't make friends easily at first. He'd learned wariness too young. But by November, he had a best friend named Owen, and by December, he was sleeping through the night consistently, and by March, he was reading above grade level because he had discovered, through some mysterious alchemy of recovery and time and one patient librarian, that he loved books. He loved books about animals. He wanted to be a veterinarian. He was 8 years old, and he wanted to be a veterinarian. The trial lasted 9 days. Walter Greer had entered a not guilty plea on all counts, and his defense strategy was exactly what Diane had predicted: generational discipline, cultural context, the word of a decorated veteran against the word of a child and a son who, his attorney implied, had ulterior motives connected to a custody dispute. The jury didn't buy it. Mrs. Alford's testimony about the documented behavioral changes and bruising she'd observed across 5 months was clear and specific and devastating. Dr. Emmons's testimony about the healed rib fractures was impossible to explain away. Sandra Briggs's testimony about the sounds she'd heard from the basement and the prior CPS case being closed without Marcus being interviewed alone established a pattern that the jury could follow. Marcus did not testify in open court. His testimony was given via a recorded statement with Dr. Reyes present, in a room with a stuffed dog on the chair beside him. He was 8 years old, and he told the truth about what had happened to him in language so clear and specific and without drama that several jurors were openly in tears. The verdict came on a Wednesday afternoon, guilty on all 3 counts. Walter Greer was sentenced to 7 years, with parole eligibility at 4. His attorney filed an appeal immediately. The appeal was denied 8 months later. I have not spoken to my father since the phone call when I told him about Marcus's broken ribs. I don't know what I would say to him if I did. The man who taught me about duty and honor and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves had used those values as window dressing for something much darker, a need for control, for dominance, for submission from anyone smaller and weaker around him. The values had always been theater. The need had always been real. I think about my mother sometimes and what she absorbed in that house over 30 years, and I grieve for her in a new way now. I think about the version of my father that existed in my imagination, the decorated veteran, the man of principle, the grandfather I'd trusted, and I grieve for that too. Not for him, for the idea of him, for the father I'd needed him to be, and the grandfather I'd believed he was. Marcus is 9 now. He goes to therapy every week and draws pictures of animals and has a best friend named Owen, who thinks dinosaurs are the greatest thing to ever walk the earth, and Marcus will argue with him for an hour that marine iguanas are objectively more interesting. He is funny. He is cautious in crowds but warm with people he trusts. He carries what happened to him. I'd be lying if I said he didn't, but he is not defined by it. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if we keep doing the work. When I came home from war, I believed the hardest fights were behind me. I was wrong. The hardest fight was in a house in Millhaven, Georgia, in a system that had decided one man's reputation was worth more than one small boy's safety. The hardest fight was learning that the armor people wear, rank, reputation, community standing, family loyalty, can be used to protect the worst things imaginable. And the hardest part of winning that fight was understanding that winning it meant losing the father I thought I had. Something real was lost. I know that. I've made peace with knowing it. But Marcus is safe. He is warm. He is learning to trust again. And every night when I check on him in his room, surrounded by books about marine iguanas and veterinary medicine, I think about the scratching sound that stopped me cold at the bottom of those basement stairs. And I think I heard it in time. That has to be enough. And slowly, carefully, it is becoming so.